Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. My name is Bruce Gilson. We are starting a new series about pulling wire. This is the first video in a 4-part series. All right, so in this video, we're gonna be covering how do you pull wire through a wall. But you have to get to the wall first, and so you might have to go through like an attic or a crawl space. We're not really talking about that. But once we get to the wall, what do we do? Let's start by talking about some of the tools and materials that you are going to need to make sure that you can properly pull wire through a wall. The first thing you're going to do is make sure you know what type of wire you're pulling and make sure you have plenty of that wire, right? So typically when you're pulling wire into a wall, you only need 1 or 2 wires into that location. Sometimes it's more than that, but most often when it's in a wall, it's a limited number of wires. So make sure you've got a box for each type of wire so that you can pull that into that location. So get your wire first. A couple of other things that you're gonna need a label maker. We are professionals. You do wanna make sure that you're labeling your cables even when you're going to be pulling your cables, because you wanna make sure that you know what cable corresponds on one side and the other side. Most often in our situations, it's on the field side versus the rack side. So you wanna make sure you label your cables. Now let's talk about a couple of other ways to label cables. You might be saying to yourself, well, Bruce, I don't have a label maker. Can I use white tape and a marker? Or can I use blue tape and a marker? The short answer is no, don't do that.
Just don't.
Now here's reason why. When you use a marker on this like glossy white tape, the label gets smudged and you can't read what it says when it arrives to wherever you pulled it to. So you could be thinking to yourself, well, but blue tape is not gonna smudge, so can I use blue tape? Well, blue tape is very brittle. It tears, it snags. It's not strong tape by design so that you can easily pull it off. But what that also means that if you use this to label your wires, most likely the tape is gonna get damaged in the labeling process. So both of these are bad options. If you only have tape and you don't have a label maker, blue is probably better.
That blue tape, you know, that makes you really look like you know what you're doing.
But you're still gonna run the risk of the label not making it to where you want it. So make sure you're labeling your cables. You're gonna want a label maker. A couple of other tools that you're gonna want, you're definitely gonna want to have some form of wire cutters. Now this is a wire cutter that we recommend. They're very large, they're designed for cutting wire, large diameter wire, they're very strong. If you don't have wire cutters that are like these, you can use like a more traditional snip type of wire. These will also work fine. But things that you want to try to avoid, you want to avoid using your wire strippers. Now your wire strippers do have like a wire cutter in them, but the problem is we want to keep these tools nice and sharp, because when we're trying to score the jacket on the outside of our wire for our termination process, if this is really dull, it becomes really difficult to score your wire. You might think, okay, well, what about using scissors? Well, the problem with scissors is that they're not designed to cut wire. So you might get a nick or a gouge inside your scissors, and then they become less effective for the purpose of which you have scissors, which is like cutting heat shrink or cutting labels or something like that. Lastly, you might think, well, what about my snips? Once again, you don't want your snips to get super dull by cutting a bunch of wire with them, and you don't want them to get nicks in them, because when you're trying to use your snips for cutting zip ties or maybe even cutting heat shrink, you want them to be nice and sharp for those purposes. So I don't recommend you use these tools. I do recommend you use these tools. So make sure you've got your label maker, make sure you got your wire cutter. You're also, when pulling through a wall, you're probably gonna want to use something like a fish stick or a glow rod. This becomes extremely handy in pulling wire through a wall. You probably don't want to use your traditional fishing wire, your pull wire. You don't want to use that, your fish tape.
We're gonna tape the fish.
Because A lot of times when you're pushing this down through a wall, it's got a bend, a curve, it doesn't go where you want it to go, and it becomes difficult to find it inside the wall. Okay, so that starts with what materials are you gonna need to get. Now, how do we approach the problem? Well, we've got to get ourselves to either the top or the bottom of the wall. In order to understand that, I'm gonna have a graphic right here of a basic wall construction. Perfect, thank you so much. So inside of a basic wall construction, you have your top, you have your bottom, and you have what are called the studs, which are the, vertical boards going between the top and the bottom. Your top is called the header, and the bottom is called the footer. You need to get to a place where you can do penetration either from the bottom or from the top. In most commercial applications, we are doing top-down penetration. We're not often going from the bottom. So let's talk primarily about going from the top down. We got to get our wire to the top of that wall so that we can do penetration from the top down, and then in between the studs is the cavity. Inside that cavity, that's where we're going to land. So you're going to start off by going into the room of which your wire is going to land, and we're going to cut in our low voltage ring. Now this is a double gang low voltage ring. Single gang is typically orange. They sometimes have three, triple gangs, but let's say we're putting in a low voltage ring that is a double gang low voltage ring. We're gonna wanna cut this into our wall first to give ourselves a hole access so that it's, now we know where the wire eventually needs to land. Now, what's the right height for your low voltage ring? Well, if you're going with a touch panel, most likely these measurements are gonna be on the prints, but a lot of times on the prints it says, basically follow the electrician's instructions. And so the electricians are gonna have a standard height for light switches, and they're gonna have a standard height for electrical outlets on the bottom. And we typically stick to those standards. If you're cutting in for a touch panel, the audio visual standard has changed. And the reason it's changed is because ADA, if someone is in a wheelchair and they are trying to see the touch panel needs to be lower than a standard wall switch so that they can visually see it. Once again, find out in your property what the ADA requirements are, but let's just go with it. They're gonna go with wall switch height. So you're gonna cut in your low voltage ring, and now you have a hole in your drywall that you can access to get to your wire. Now let's go back up to the attic, but you're gonna need a helper. You don't wanna do this by yourself. So you can leave one person there at the hole in the wall, and another person is going to go into the attic and gonna be sending the wire down. The method that is most recommended is for you to use a glow rod. You're gonna connect your wire to the end of the glow rod. And when we do that, we're gonna take our E-tape, and I forgot to mention earlier that you're gonna need E-tape. Whenever pulling wire in any situation, you definitely need E-tape.
I once watched him eat electrical tape right off the roll.
When you're taping up your wire to your glow rod, you wanna make sure that you not only secure the tip of the wire, but you also wanna make sure you secure this portion. And the number one reason is because you might have to back pull it. And if you leave this as a connection edge, if you push it through your penetration point and then you try to pull back for some reason, you might snag up and then you can't get back through the hole. So you're gonna want to secure both ends of that. When you take your tape, I highly recommend you putting a buddy tab on there so that you can easily take your tape off later. And then now our glow rod is connected to our wire, and this determines what size penetration we need. We need a penetration that is significantly larger, not like huge, but big enough so that this can easily slide through the hole without a whole lot of obstruction. If you've got more than one wire, then you can get an idea of how all those wires, let's say there's 4 wires plus your glow rod, you're gonna wanna get an idea of how big that is, and you wanna penetrate through. Now, if you're dealing with wooden construction, you're probably gonna have to drill your own penetration point into the header. If you're dealing with steel or metal, aluminum studs, there's typically holes already built in and you can use one of those holes. Now, the reason that we recommend using a fish stick or glow rod in order to do this, now let's imagine that we've got somebody on the other side of this hole and we're going from the top down into the wall. You want to be able to see this part of the glow stick through the hole so that you can pull it through. So then as it goes through, eventually your wire is gonna show up through it as well, all right? I know that sounds a little bit, normal, but what often happens is the glow rod doesn't perfectly line up. It's gonna be like out here somewhere. And then the guy inside the attic is gonna have to push the glow rod around, and then until the person that's at the hole in the wall can eventually see it, then they can pull it up, pull the end through, and then you can get your wire through your low voltage ring into your destination. So, pretty simple stuff when you really think about it, but a couple of little steps and to make sure that you're prepared properly. I hope you enjoyed that portion of the video, and if you're enjoying the series, make sure that you watch part 4, where I've got video of me on a job site pulling wire, and I'm gonna cover some things in that video that apply to every aspect of pulling wire that I didn't talk about in this video. So make sure you watch part 4. That's how you pull wire through a wall. We can't wait to see you on the next video. And if you think to yourself, man, this is cool, I wanna see more, I wanna learn the whole series, make sure that you like, you subscribe, and you stay notified. We'll see you in the next one.